Today, we're diving into one of the most complex and honestly misunderstood conditions in mental health, dissociative identity disorder, or DID. It's a diagnosis that doesn't just challenge the person living with it, but sometimes it challenges the very clinicians who are supposed to be helping.
And that brings us to a really critical question, right? What happens when the people providing the care are hesitant or maybe even scared to believe the diagnosis that's staring them right in the face? Well, it creates this dangerous conflict where a clinician's fear can end up completely overshadowing a patient's needs, and the results can be devastating.
So let's start at the beginning, at the root of the problem, what some are calling the fear of believing. I mean, why would a trained professional hesitate to diagnose DID in the first place? Well, the sources we looked at suggest it often comes from this deep-seated professional anxiety. This quote, wow, it just gets right to the heart of it. You have a provider admitting they were scared of being challenged by lawyers or even their own colleagues if they couldn't perfectly defend a DID diagnosis. It's this fear of looking foolish, of not being able to explain every little nuance that can lead them to just avoid the diagnosis entirely. And that fear often gets propped up by these rigid, almost cinematic ideas of what DID is supposed to look like. As you can see here, a provider might expect a patient to hear actual auditory voices, but in reality, their alters might be communicating through things like notes or emails. They expect alters to be ashamed and hide, but a patient might be discovering new parts of their system pretty quickly. And here's the big one. They look for consistent memory, when fragmented memory, amnesia, is a core symptom of the disorder itself.
So, just to make sure we're all on the same page, let's nail down a clear definition. DID is a condition that comes from severe trauma, usually in childhood, and it's marked by a few key things. Multiple distinct identity states, which you might know as alters, dissociative amnesia, meaning really significant gaps in memory, and switching, which is the shift from one alter to another. These aren't just quirks, they're the fundamental mechanics of the disorder.
So if a provider is too scared to diagnose DID, what do? Well, they don't just stop. They often substitute it with something else. And this brings us to what the sources call the dysregulation ruse.
The term they often pivot to is emotional dysregulation. Now, on its own, it just means having a tough time managing your emotions. But in this context, it becomes this convenient alternative diagnosis, often tied to borderline personality disorder, or BPD. For some clinicians, it just feels like a safer, less controversial label to use.
And here you can see that pivot in action. This quote from a consulting provider is so explicit. They looked at all the evidence and decided, no, the problem isn't multiple personalities, it's a personality component. They actively dismissed the DID framework and went straight for a personality disorder explanation instead.
And when you relabel the diagnosis, you end up relabeling the symptoms too. Suddenly, the act of switching between distinct identities, that's just a mood swing. And that severe dissociative amnesia we talked about, it gets pushed aside, totally ignored, because it just doesn't fit into this new, incorrect box they've created.
Now, this is way more than just a disagreement over words. This kind of misinterpretation has profound real-world consequences. And that leads us to our third section, when help becomes harm. This is where the theory becomes a practical nightmare for the patient. See, the go-to treatment for emotional dysregulation and BPD is a type of therapy called dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT. And look, DBT is a skills-based approach that can be incredibly effective for the right condition. But when you misapply it to someone with undiagnosed DID, it can be actively harmful. And what's wild is that the patient themselves knew the therapy wasn't going to work. DBT requires a lot of tracking, like keeping diaries. But this patient understood that their dissociative amnesia, the communication barriers between their alters, made that completely impossible. They could see the train wreck coming from a mile away. And this slide really just lays out the tragic disconnect. The patient's reality is a disability. I have lost time. I can't track my behaviors. But the provider, who's working from the wrong diagnosis, sees a behavioral problem. They see the patient's inability to do the homework as willfulness or refusal to engage. They're literally punishing the patient for having the symptoms of their actual illness. And the outcome is as infuriating as it is predictable. The patient was officially kicked out of a therapy group. And why? Because the core symptom of her DID, her memory disorder, kept her from filling out the therapy's paperwork. She was dismissed from treatment for being sick.
This whole situation creates an impossible bind for the patient, a true catch-22 that the sources call the treatment trap.
Let's walk through this vicious cycle. Step 1. A patient experiences a core symptom, like switching alters. Step 2.
The therapist mislabels it as dysregulation. Step 3. The therapist then demands the patient just stop having the symptom. And here's the real kicker. Step 4. They withhold the actual trauma therapy that could help until the patient is regulated. In other words, until the patient somehow manages to cure themselves first. The damage from this trap is just immense. We're talking profound invalidation, where the patient's entire reality is denied. Trust in the very people who are supposed to help is just destroyed. It actively stops any real progress, and it can even be re-traumatizing, mirroring past experiences where they weren't believed. And in the end, it just leaves the patient completely and utterly alone.
And nothing illustrates this experience better than the patient's own words. In a letter to their team, they wrote this. Just try to imagine that. Trying to fight for your own care when you can't even be sure what you said moments ago because a different part of you is present. It's an impossible, terrifying position to be in.
And so, that leaves us with this final critical question. When the prescribed cure actively punishes the symptoms of the actual illness, what is the system really treating? Is it the patient's trauma, or is it the provider's own fear and discomfort? It's a question that really challenges us to look deeper at how we approach diagnoses that defy our easy expectations.